If and when science and data supports it, our educators want to be back. There is not one educator that does not want to be back with their students, not one. There are some places where the infection rates are very low, but then here in Los Angeles, the infection rates are quite high. And there's no way in good conscience I could say I would support educators going back if the science and the data doesn't support it.
I don't feel safe because in the past, we've had issues with cleanliness inside the school. And to now know that, you know, the pandemic is raging and just a reassurance that the building is going to be cleaned and that we'll have enough PPE for students and teachers. It's just really hard for me to feel safe going back into the school.
Some of our schools have thousands and thousands of students. Even if you cut that down in half, it's just a lot. And then you think about, okay, that student goes home to their family, or they might go to an after-school program or a daycare, right, before they go home. And then you start to build this web in your head. You start to think of how many people are we interacting with?
We need to take a step back and say, what happens if a student gets infected, and then they infect the rest of the students in the class and the teacher? What is the Board of Education going to do to help? What's the government going to do to help? What's the legislator going to do to help us? The Black Lives Matter, in conjunction with the pandemic, it kind of illuminated all of the inequalities that take place in the Black community with all of the lack of resources, the disinvestment in communities of color, and then now just the lack of resources even to get education.
Everywhere there's systemic, structural, institutional racism, it's our job to root it out from its very foundations. That means looking at the institutions, programs, and policies to really break those barriers down. Our students are asking for that, and it is incumbent upon us to do that work.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.